Statement, Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, with your permission, I'd like to make a statement on the release in error of Hadush Kebatu from HMP Chelmsford last Friday morning. As the House will be aware, Mr Kebatu was apprehended by the Metropolitan Police on Sunday morning in the Finsbury Park area of my constituency. He's back where he belongs, behind bars, and I'd like to thank the Metropolitan Police, Essex Police and the British Transport Police for their swift action to return him to custody, and the public who helped locate Kebatu after the police's appeal. I can tell the House that he will now be transported for deportation back to Ethiopia as quickly as possible. However, this does not change the fact that Mr Kebatu's victims are rightly outraged about what has happened, and I'm livid on their behalf. And on behalf of the public, this was a mistake that should not have happened. The victims expect better, the public expects better, and this government expects better from a critical public service, which plays a vital role in our first duty to keep the British people safe and free from harm. Madam Deputy Speaker, on Friday the 24th of October, Mr Kebatu was scheduled to be transferred from HMP Chelmsford to an immigration removal centre, from which he was to be deported. Due to what appears to have been human error, he was instead released into the community at 10:25 a.m. Shortly after 12 p.m, concerns were raised about the release to the duty governor, and following checks, staff were dispatched to locate him. When it became clear that he was no longer in the vicinity of the prison, Essex Police were notified and a manhunt began. Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service instigated an immediate investigation, and I've asked for the initial findings to be with me this week. And the House will appreciate that in the meantime there is a limit, obviously, on what I can say, but members will be aware that there are national security considerations within a case like this, and I will update the House in the appropriate way as soon as I can. But what I can say today is that there must and there will be accountability for what has happened. Madam Deputy Speaker, when I was first informed of the release in error, I spoke immediately to the duty governor at Chelmsford and senior HMPPS leaders to understand what was known and seek assurances about the immediate measures being taken. I tasked my officials working through the night and coordinated a response with the Home Office and the police. And I'd like to put on record my thanks to the Home Secretary for her engagement over the weekend. I also chaired 3 operational meetings with the police, and on Sunday was able to travel to Wood Green Police Station just outside my constituency to personally thank the police officers who caught Kebatu. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been clear from the outset that a mistake of this nature is unacceptable. We must get to the bottom of what happened and take immediate action to try and prevent similar releases in error to protect the public from harm. First, on Friday, I instructed the CEO of Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service to carry out an urgent review, to look at the checks that take place when a prisoner is released and identify immediate changes that can be made to the process in order to mitigate against the risks of release in error. As a result, HMPPS have taken steps to make these processes more robust. There will now be more direct senior accountability for ensuring protocols and checks are correctly applied, including a clear checklist for governors to determine that every step has been followed the evening before any release takes place. These are the strongest release checks that have ever been in place, and they will apply to every release from custody and are effective immediately. Second, any foreign national offender being removed through the early removal scheme, the scheme through which Kebatu was supposed to be removed from the country, can now only be discharged when the duty governor is physically present, and there will be no ERS removals from HMP Chelmsford for the rest of this week. And third, I'm today announcing that there will be an independent investigation by Dame Lynn Owers. I spoke to her yesterday, former Deputy Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police and Director General of the National Crime Agency, and she will fully establish the facts of Kebatu's release and whether staff had sufficient experience, training and technology, and she will also talk to the victims in this case to understand the effect this incident had on them. Her report will highlight points of failure and make recommendations to help prevent further releases in error, which have been rising year on year since 2021, going from 9 per month on average in 2023 to 17 per month in the period spanning January to June 2024. And I'm clear that a single release in error is one too many, which is why we have launched this independent investigation. And I can tell the House that it will have the same status as those into other prison incidents, including the awful attack on 3 prison officers at HMP Franklin in April of this year, and the escape of Daniel Khalife from HMP Wandsworth in 2023 under the last government. Madam Deputy Speaker, releases in error are a symptom of a system that we inherited from the party opposite.
Truth hurts.
Jails were full almost to breaking point, and the threat of total collapse in law and order. The fact is that we were left with prisons reeling from historic funding reductions. Madam Deputy Speaker, a 24% real terms cut from 2010 to 2015 and 30% cuts in staffing, leaving us today with over 50% of frontline prison officers having less than 5 years' experience. It's little wonder, then, when the system has been brought to its knees, that errors like this happen. We must also be honest that the previous government's approach to this crisis, piecemeal, complex emergency releases in the hope that the system wouldn't collapse, has added to a level of complexity and pressure that makes errors more likely. This government has been transparent about the difficult decisions necessary to fix the mess for good so that prisons can keep us safe, and future governments need not find emergency solutions to free up capacity. And this government has brought forward the sentencing bill currently making its way through this House. It will ensure we have a suitable criminal justice system, one which can deliver punishment that works, that cuts crime and keeps the public safe. And this government's also building 14,000 additional prison places so that we have capacity to lock up the most dangerous offenders. This is the largest prison expansion since the Victorian era. And let's be clear, there will be more people in prison at the end of this Parliament than there have ever been before. Yes. And we've already built 2,500 additional prison places in just over a year, compared to 500 added overall to the prison estate under the Tories. And we're deporting more foreign criminals than the last government. We've changed the law last month to speed up the early removal scheme, something that, to be fair, the Shadow Justice Secretary called for, so that most foreign prisoners can now be deported after serving 30% of their custodial sentence rather than the previous 50%. And through the sentencing bill, we will go even further to deport foreign criminals as soon as possible after sentencing. I can confirm that in the year to July 2025, we sent 5,179 foreign national offenders back to the countries of origin, a 14% increase on the previous 12 months. This frees up desperately needed prison places and saves the taxpayer the £54,000 per year in cost to hold an individual offender. Madam Deputy Speaker, this context sets out the scale of the challenge, but I'm clear that releases in error are not simply a fact of life. The public will not accept that, and neither does the government. We'll get to the bottom of what happened in this case. We will take whatever steps necessary to tackle the spike in releases in error so that we can uphold the first duty of every government to keep the public safe from harm. I commend this statement to the House.
I call Robert Jenrick, Shadow Secretary of State.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, dear, oh dear, where to begin? This Justice Secretary could not deport the only small boat migrant who who tried to be deported. Yes. Having been mistakenly released, Hadush Kebatu came back to prison asking to be deported, not once, not twice, but 5 times. But he was turned away. Madam Deputy Speaker, the only illegal migrants this government are stopping are those that actually want to leave the UK. His officials, briefing the press, called it the mother of all. Yeah, they're not wrong, are they? Calamity Lammy strikes again. It's a national embarrassment. And today, the Justice Secretary feigns anger at what's happened. He says he is livid Kebatu was mistakenly let out. But under his plans to abolish short prison sentences that he forced through the Commons last week, Kebatu would never have even stepped foot in prison in the first place. So let's get it straight. We had the spectacle of the Metropolitan Police scouring London to find a man the Justice Secretary is simultaneously legislating to avoid sending to prison. What an absolute farce. So look, I must commend the Justice Secretary's performance. It is truly BAFTA worthy. He has perfected the art of performative outrage to a T. On Wednesday, well look, they may be laughing, but let me finish this point. On Wednesday, he will force every one of his MPs to vote again on the sentencing bill, which will see hundreds of sex offenders, just like Kebatu, avoid prison altogether. Sick men who destroy the lives of young girls, who steal their childhoods from them, they will be free to roam your communities, to steal the childhoods of your constituents. And I'll tell you who'll be livid then. The British public will be livid, and they'll know who's to blame. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Justice Secretary says he's launched an inquiry into what's happened. But he should be able to provide some basic questions to the House now. With respect to the prison in question, HMP Chelmsford, there's clearly a very significant problem. In a previous internal audit at Chelmsford, officials had marked their own homework as good, yet inspectors rated it as of serious concern. What is the Justice Secretary going to do now to address the way in which problems in our prisons are covered up routinely or wished away? On the subject of the inquiry itself, you won't be surprised to hear I am, how shall I put it, sceptical about this government's ability to conduct inquiries with any competence. Why is it limiting itself to this particular security farce and not the other glaring errors, like the doubling of drone sightings above prisons, the soaring assault on prison officers, or the rampant extremism we're now seeing in our jails? Shocking as this accidental release is, it is not a one-off blunder. It has come to be the norm under this government, as the number of prisoners mistakenly let out early has more than doubled. So can the Justice Secretary tell the House how many of the 262 prisoners let out mistakenly in the year to March were violent or sexual offenders? And how many are still at large? There are now record numbers of foreign nationals clogging up our prisons, more than under the last government. How many of those 262 prisoners accidentally released are migrants like Kebatu who were awaiting deportation? Madam Deputy Speaker, can the Justice Secretary give the House his cast iron assurance that this man will be deported from our country by the end of the week, as he promised on the news on Sunday? And if he fails, will he take responsibility and resign? And lastly, on Tuesday, the Justice Secretary blocked my amendment to release the migrant crime data. Does he now finally acknowledge that there is a link between the small boats and crime in this country? And will he call the small boats out for what they are, a national security emergency? Madam Deputy Speaker, this man should never have been in our country in the first place. That's the truth. He should have been detained. He should have been deported. Instead, he was put up in a hotel in Epping and allowed to prey on schoolgirls. Now we learn that some Labour officials privately concede that they were wrong to scrap the Rwanda plan. Be in no doubt, from start to finish, the Kebatu fiasco was a creation entirely of Labour's own making. So I say to the Justice Secretary, there's no point coming to the House today professing to be livid at the consequences of your own policies. The British people, they can see straight through you.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a serious issue, and that's why there will be a full independent investigation. The Shadow Justice Secretary, I'll give him this, he's smooth. But as my mother would have said, if he was chocolate, he'd lick himself. He should hang his head in shame. The crisis in our prisons that we're faced today is because of 14 years of failure under his government. As they were packing their bags, and he knows this, to leave office, temporary release failures were under his watch. They presided over 17 mistaken releases per month. This didn't happen overnight. It was not inevitable. It was the choices that his party made through 14 years of chaos. They said that they were the government of security and safety. They oversaw rising violent crime and crumbling courts and crumbling prisons. Again and again, they promised 20,000 extra prison places, and they managed an extra 500 in 14 years. They promised to remove more foreign national offenders from prisons. They failed. They promised investment and expansion in the prison system, but budgets stalled. They promised investment in the police, but again, we saw the police cut by 20,000. They promised increases in access to justice. We did not see that. We saw almost the collapse of legal aid. Violence went up in our prisons. Self-harm went up in our prisons. Drug abuse went up in our prisons. And prison officer numbers were cut under his watch. And he comes here and has the brass neck to give the impression that this started just 14 months ago. Let me just pause there. William Fernandez was released in error in March 2021. He was a sexual predator. He raped a 16-year-old and sexually assaulted another young woman after he was let out by prison in 2021. Was there an independent investigation? No, not from their side. Rayan Nubi, released in error in March 2023. Again, a man who was mistaken released from a Category B prison. Was there an independent investigation under his watch? No, there wasn't. Laura Matavoulis, again released in error in December 2021. Was there any independent investigation? None at all. And he comes here with the brass neck. I've asked Lynn Owens to look at this. I've asked her if she can do it. in 8 months. Of course, we'll come back to the House when that, in 8 weeks, when that is done. And all of what he has said, what happened, looking over this period of time, is subject to that review. And then he says that the sentencing review will actually let more foreign nationals out. He's wrong. We've actually brought down the threshold so that you can now be deported with just a suspended sentence. He knows that. Read clause 42 of the bill and he will understand it properly.
Chair of the Select Committee, Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given the pressure on prison front desks and the complexity of rules for release, this was an accident waiting to happen. One thing that might bring down the number of releases in error is the digitising of prisoner records. On visits to prisons, Justice Committee members are often horrified to find them relying on handwritten files. While some parts of the justice system are entertaining AI, why are prisons still run on pen and paper systems?
Minister.
Well, the right honourable friend raises a very important point, and he knows that up to this day, in part because of concerns about the use of technology by prisoners, there largely isn't Wi-Fi or anything like that available on our prison sites. And for that reason, it is a paper-based system which will always be subject to some human error. But in the context in which, under the last government, there was this continued early release scheme done on the quiet, and indeed, because of the changes that we're making in the sentencing bill, it is right that we have a proper look at this. And I did discuss it within OAS when we spoke yesterday.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Jess Brown-Fuller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We in the Liberal Democrats are relieved that Kebatu has been recaptured after what must have been a terrifying few days for his victims, and echo the Justice Secretary's remarks thanking Essex Police, the Metropolitan Police and British Transport Police. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, his recapture doesn't excuse the serious mistakes that caused this to happen in the first place. It's totally unacceptable that the safety of the public was ever put at risk. HMP Chelmsford is a remand prison, one that regularly deals with prisoners coming and going, and therefore should be entirely capable of handling situations like this. Yet we know from His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons that there are deep-seated inadequacies at Chelmsford, including inexperienced staff and a lack of adequate training, especially identified in pre-release documents. At the same time, we have seen worrying trends nationally in mistaken prisoner releases, with 262 prisoners released by accident in the year 2025, up from 115 the year prior. So we in the Liberal Democrats do recognise that the government inherited a mess when it comes to prisons, but they should have taken serious steps to address the shortfalls and staffing issues in prisons, which are now clearly putting the public at risk. So I would like to ask the Secretary of State what steps his government is taking to address work culture and training issues in our prisons, especially those like HMP Chelmsford, where concerns have already been raised in the past. I welcome the Secretary of State's announcement of an independent investigation following repeated calls by my honourable friend, the member for Chelmsford, whose constituents were put at risk. But can he confirm what consequences those found at fault will face? And pending the outcome of the investigation, does he agree that anyone responsible should face the sack? Does he believe that the new safeguards that he is putting in place will prevent this from ever happening again? And finally, for Kebatu's victims, who will have spent the weekend incredibly distressed, what support was provided to those victims and their families over the weekend when they were aware of the perpetrator being at large, and will that support continue on?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for the tone of her remarks. And she's absolutely right that it was entirely unacceptable. And understandably, the victims of those crimes would have been very, very anxious, and their families over the course of the weekend. And the public at large would have been anxious, particularly women and children. She is right, however, that there are issues, because we now have 50% of staff in our prisons who are effectively new on the job. as a result of what we inherited. And it is important that we give them the appropriate support and training over this period. She knows, because I've said it from this dispatch box, that it's our intention to grow the number of prison places and to build new prisons, 14,000 places by 2031. And in that context, it's important that we grow the number of officers as well and support them. She knows too the importance of probation in this context, and the 700 million that we've allocated to support our probation service at this time is really important. She will recognise that in a system that releases 57,000 prisoners every year, that many of those prisoners are released appropriately, under licence. Some of those prisoners are reporting to probation, they're reporting to home, they're reporting for tags, and many of them, a proportion that's gone up, are reporting for early removal. And it's for all of those reasons that it's important that Lynn Owers gets to the bottom of what happened in this circumstance.
Matt Bishop.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the weekend, we heard comments from party members opposite talking about this being the Labour Party releasing this prisoner early. This is a rather silly comment. The Labour Party didn't release anybody. Okay. However, I wonder if the Deputy Prime Minister would agree with me that actually what does cause, contribute and create problems such as where these mistakes can genuinely happen has not come from the 14 months we've been in power, but the 14 years of austerity and cuts that the party opposite caused.
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I just think, as a statement of fact, the party opposite does recognise the inheritance that we had in this context was poor. Now, the public want to ensure that whomever is in government keeps them safe, and that people aren't being released from prison in the wrong way. And that's why it's important that there's a full independent investigation into this and that the system learns the lessons. I listed previous cases where there was no full or independent investigation. We could have learnt from this earlier if the other party had acted.
Father of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
The crisis about small boats crossing the Channel is utterly debilitating and is alienating millions of people from the whole political process. And imagine how the whole atmosphere would lighten if the government had come here today and said, this sort of farce can't continue, and from midnight tonight, if you land illegally on these shores, we will get out of any convention, you will be detained and deported immediately from where you've come from. But I want to ask a particular constituency point. Such is the crisis around how to house people. There are reports today in the Times and other newspapers that the government is thinking of opening disused military sites and is looking at 2 or 3 in particular. Now, the government gave a solemn promise that they would not use RAF Scampton to house illegal migrants. Can you confirm that solemn promise still stands?
Secretary of State.
He's heard, and he heard the Housing Secretary talking about this morning, that we are looking at military sites, and there are a number of them that we're looking intently. I'm afraid I'm unable to give him the reassurance in relation to his own constituency because I haven't got the list in front of me, but I will ensure that the appropriate minister makes contact with him.
Maureen de Jos.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is, of course, deeply concerning that a dangerous criminal was released onto the streets, and this should not have happened. But I do want to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his honest assessment of what happened and for acknowledging that what happened was wrong. But does he agree with me that we are actually dealing with 14 years of Tory neglect with overcrowded and understaffed prisons, and when things go wrong, as they have done, it is essential that we take swift and decisive action so that the public's trust in the justice system is maintained, and that is exactly what we are doing now.
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman. The truth is that under this government, in our first year in office, over 5,100 foreign national offenders were removed from this country. That's the truth. We've removed 2,500 more from prison than in recent times. And the truth is under the last government, there were 800 releases in error and no full independent investigation. That is the truth, and it's under this watch that we're going to change that.
Marie Goldman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The trial, sentencing and mistaken release of Hadush Kebatu, all took place in the heart of my Chelmsford constituency, and it is entirely unacceptable. I firstly want to thank Essex Police, British Transport Police and the Metropolitan Police, as well as the public's vigilance, for ensuring that he was apprehended and will now be deported. I welcome the announcement of an independent investigation, but the government must ensure that any recommendations are implemented in full, without delay, and not just left to gather dust on a bookshelf. Turning to prison leadership, does the Justice Secretary agree with me that scapegoating a single prison officer for systemic failure is unacceptable, and that if leaders, including prison governors, are found to be at fault, they should resign?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I know that this has been shocking for her constituents, and I know that the reports and the scenes of this prisoner wandering around Chelmsford will have been incredibly disturbing, and particularly disturbing for the victims of her crime. And I know that she has spoken to the prisons minister, and I'm very grateful that she reached out in the way that she has, and I think she's spoken to the governor as well. Now, I know that we have suspended the officer involved pending an investigation. That must be right and proper. But I hope that she will recognise, in asking Dame Lynn Owens to look at this closely, that of course we will take seriously her recommendations, and I will ensure that this House has full scrutiny of those recommendations when they come forward.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The case of Kebatu exposed deep failings in our prison system. As a result, as we heard, 14 years of failure by the previous Tory government. Failings made worse by chronic staff shortages. Now, the immediate reckless skilled visa rule change risks forcing hundreds of experienced overseas officers out of the service overnight. At HMP Liverpool, 40% of staff could be affected. So can the Minister explain how stripping our prisons of trained staff will make them safer or help prevent further failures like these seen in Mr Kebatu's case?
Very grateful to my honourable friend, and I want to reassure her that the Prison Minister is talking to Home Office colleagues about these very same issues at this time.
Dr Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, my thoughts are with the victims of this sex offender's crimes, including the 14-year-old Epping schoolgirl. They and their families want answers as to how this major breach could have happened. Now, the Prime Minister and the Justice Secretary have said that they were appalled and livid. Well, that's great. So is everyone. But ministers are not commentators. Exactly. They are in charge, and ultimately, they are accountable for this. Madam Deputy Speaker, this hasn't gone away for the people of Epping. The twice-weekly protests continue. No one wants to see our town repeatedly the lead story in the news, and the events of recent days have raised again community anxiety and distress. Will the government now get a grip on this issue, address the illegal immigration crisis that has spun out of control on their watch, and do the right and safe thing and close the Bell Hotel immediately?
Secretary of State.
Well, the honourable gentleman is right in the beginning of his question to centre the victims of these crimes and their anxiety and to hold that dear. And it's why the first thing I said to Lynn Owens was, would she reach out to those victims and just hear from them as she went about her work. I'm quite sure, because I know Epping very well, I'm quite sure that his constituents know that the crisis that we inherited begun under the last government, and their discontent in relation to asylum and immigration, the inability of the last government to deal with the gangs, the collapse of the Rwanda scheme, and the outrage of asylum hotels all begun under the last government, and he knows that as well as I do.
Chris Webb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank my right friend, Deputy Prime Minister, for coming today to address this serious issue. Many of my constituents raised it with me over the weekend. I do notice not a single member from Reform here, especially the member for Runcorn. I'm assuming she's still running scared after horrific racist remarks over the weekend. But can the Deputy Prime Minister confirm that deportation of Kebatu will proceed unhindered and without delay to...
Order. I'd ask the honourable gentleman to ponder on his words and perhaps suggest that he does withdraw that remark that he's just made about another honourable member from this chamber.
Okay, on your advice, I withdraw that remark. So, to finish my question, will the Deputy Prime Minister ensure that there is a swift plan that when mistakes are made, it's essential to ensure that public trust is remained in these justice systems?
State.
Well, my honourable friend is right. And it's hugely important because it's important to put in context not only the victims who would have been anxious, but also the inheritance of the backlog in our courts so that people can't get justice. He's right also to reference the honourable member for Runcorn, who I see is not in her seat, despite her very inflammatory statements over the weekend.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is outrageous that Kebatu was not deported at the end of his sentence. What is worse is that the number of prisoners released by mistake has more than doubled under this government. Now, if the Deputy Prime Minister is determined to release thousands more prisoners early, how confident is he that this mistake will not be repeated again and again on his watch?
Secretary of State.
Well, can I say to him that there is actually a point of agreement between the two main parties, and that is that foreign national offenders who commit crimes should be deported as quickly as possible. And under the sentencing bill, we are attempting to do that. And it's actually something that the Shadow Justice Secretary has raised, and I think that's one point at least of agreement. I'm serious about getting to grips with the early release issue. And I'm serious when I say, and he knows this, that this story begun before we came to office. It's why one of our most senior police officers will be looking at this issue, and of course we will take serious all of her recommendations. It's hugely important that the public see the system working and that they feel safe.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Hadush Kebatu is clearly a depraved individual and a dangerous pervert who should be booted out of the country without delay. But my constituents get sick and tired of having to foot the bill of the cost of housing foreign national offenders in British jails. And so, therefore, can he reassure them that the sentencing bill will make it much easier to deport those individuals and make sure they're in foreign jails where they belong rather than clogging up our prisons?
Well, my honourable friend's exactly right. £54,000 it costs a year to have any individual in prison in our country. It's a lot of money. And that's why it's important that we reduce the period that they're in our country, and that once they've been convicted and served 30% of their time, that we can deport them back to where they come from. And that's where, of course, Kebatu should be and should experience over the course of the next few days.
Tessa Mont, is you rising? Tessa Mont? No. Richard Ford.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the breakout from prison of Hadush Kebatu sounds less like the Great Escape and more like Fawlty Towers. it has helped bring to light that 262 prisoners were released by mistake last year and 115 were released by mistake the year before. For mistaken releases, what assurance can the Justice Secretary offer that the responsible contractors or subcontractors will be subject to the sort of financial penalties that motivate them to prevent further mistakes from happening?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm not sure in this circumstance that this was subcontracted. He will understand that when we look at the 56,000 or so prisoners who are released from prison, many are being released into the hands of probation and asked to report to a probation office. Some are released for time served. There are both housing, employment, assessment needs, and he's right, I think behind his question, many are tagged at home. For some reason, Kebatu found himself in the wrong stream because for foreign national offenders, it's an immigration removal centre and it's off on a plane, and that's what should have happened.
Justice Sato.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the fact that Dame Lynn Owens will be speaking to the victims of Kebatu to understand the impact on them. But can the Deputy Prime Minister confirm whether the previous government made any steps to speak with victims affected by prison release errors under their watch due to starving the system of funding?
Secretary of State.
There were many cases of early prisoner release, and as I said before, whether it was William Fernandez in March 2021, whether it was Rayon Nubi in March 2023, or Loris Matavusas in December 2021, there were no independent investigations under the last government. Very little was said, or it would seem learned, even though 800 were released early. So this is a story that goes back a long way. It's in part because of the scheme that was set up under the last government and revised 4 times in the run-up to the general election, and it's why we must take a thorough look and reassure the public.
Simon Hall.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Justice Secretary will know that police operational independence, free from political interference, is crucial and is enshrined in the police protocol.
Yeah.
And yet on page 3 of the statement, which the Secretary of State has just given us this afternoon, he told us, and I checked against delivery, over the weekend I chaired 3 operational meetings with the police.
Yeah, what's that all about?
What's changed?
Nice. Secretary of State.
Well, I know that the Right Honourable Gentleman has a tremendous experience in this chamber. I think he would think it was extremely lackadaisical if the Justice Secretary did not seek operational update from the police over the course of the weekend when this was top of the news cycle and of huge anxiety. Of course, operational matters are for the police, but I'm hugely grateful, and I said so to Mark Rowley this morning, and I was very pleased that it's local officers in the London Borough of Haringey that were able to detain Kebatu, and that's why I went up to Wood Green to thank them personally for what they had done.
Jonathan Davies.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The erroneous release of this individual was an appalling error. I'm grateful it has been caught and that the Justice Secretary will take steps to get to the bottom of what went wrong in this case. And I would be grateful if he comes back to the House in due course to report on his findings. Now, we know this government, when it started last year, inherited an appalling situation in respect of the prison estates, prisons fit to bursting and short staff. In fact, perhaps that's when the general election came when it did, rather than in the autumn, because there would have had to have been a prisoner release scheme later that year under the previous government. But I am sick of people coming to my constituency surgeries who have been victims of crime, who feel that justice is not being done. So can I urge him to redouble his efforts for this, to build up the prison places, but also take the steps to ensure that people, certainly at lower levels of crime, don't get into crime in the first place, because that's the way we save money in the long run.
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and he's right to mention the end of early supervision licence scheme that was set up by the last government, revised 4 times, 10,000 people were released. It was done effectively on the quiet. It was done in a chaotic way, and that's when we began to see this spike. It's not about making partisan or political points, but the truth is we all know that the prison system that we inherited was in a dire situation, and we do need now to get a grip where mistakes are being made, and that's why the officer involved is suspended under investigation. The checks and balances in place are now the toughest that we've had. We're asking duty governors to be looking at this the night before, particularly in relation to foreign national offenders, and we've got Dame Lynn Owens doing a further investigation.
Ms Saville Roberts.
I'd like to put on record my role as the co-chair of the Justice Union's parliamentary group. Everyone here will want to make sure that this kind of outrageous error never happens again. The Chief Inspector of Prisons warned today of a systematic problem of increased releases and error, citing very busy people, often quite inexperienced, with huge caseloads. He also warned that prisons are dependent on West African officers who we might now lose thanks to changes to visa thresholds expected to cause, and I quote, an enormously damaging effect to some prisons. With this in mind, because his government has control over this, will the Justice Secretary press the Home Office to look again at how changes to the skilled workers visa are directly causing prison staff shortages and worsening prison performance?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for putting on record the challenge that we have with junior staff, and I'm very grateful to the work that we have in our prison system of those staff who are much beloved, who have come from West Africa, largely Nigeria, to support this system for a period of time. And I do recognise the challenges that she articulates, and of course, as she would expect, all of these matters are under discussion.
Christine.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his statement today. I can also thank the member for Epping for him starting his question with a recognition that this really affects the victims of this terrible crime. And I think we all need to recognise the devastating effect this will have on families who are victims of crime when the person who's committed those crimes is released in this way. What reassurance can the Deputy Prime Minister give residents in my constituency of Harlow that this government will finally get on top of this issue, get on the front foot of this issue and finally tackle it?
Secretary of State.
Well, can I begin by just wishing my honourable friend congratulations. I know he's just returning from paternity leave. We're grateful to that. And, you know, I know his constituency of Harlow very, very well. I think it's got one of the highest proportions of Spurs supporters in the country. And I know those folk would have taken this very seriously. And I'd want to reassure them that we've asked one of our best senior police officers to lead this review, where we put in place immediate checks in the system that are the toughest that have ever been in place, really, for release. Of course, the officer involved has had to be suspended pending that full investigation, and the prison service themselves are doing their own investigation immediately begun that will report to me later on this week.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Mr. Kebatu came to this country by small boat, allegedly because he was seeking asylum against oppression in Ethiopia. At his trial, however, he changed his mind and decided he'd rather be back in Ethiopia. What bothers me about the state of our immigration system is that if, after he has been punished in Ethiopia, he hops on another small boat and comes back again and says that he's seeking asylum because, as a result of his conviction for sexual crimes, he faces disapproval and possibly persecution in Ethiopia, we'd have to go through this farce all over again, wouldn't we?
Yeah. Secretary of State.
Well, I recognise the concern that may well be on the minds of his constituents and indeed mine. But the biometric system that we have in place should alleviate that, of course. And he's right. In the trial, he said he wanted to go back to Ethiopia, and that is where he now belongs.
Shanberry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State has rightly talked about prisons reeling from historic funding and staffing cuts, yet he admits that other current ministers have added to this problem by changing the visa rules in July that will force many overseas prison officers out of the country. He just called them much beloved staff. He just said that he recognises the challenges. So will he confirm that he has asked the Home Secretary to look again at her visa changes for these prison officers?
It's my job to ensure that we have the right amount of prison officers in the system and that they're supported to do their job. And I'd want to tell her that, of course, she would expect that that is a #1 priority for the department, the right number of prison officers to do the job, recognising that many of them are now have little experience as a result of the changes that were made under the last government, but also the right number of probation staff, and we are doing both.
Wendy Martin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This accidental release of Kebatu is beyond belief. It's a national embarrassment. But what I find really, really disturbing is being sitting here on the backbenches watching the Justice Secretary laugh at some of the responses. And I find that wholly unpalatable. And I am left wondering what the victims must be thinking. When will he resign?
I've got a lot of respect for the Right Honourable Lady. I just remind her that I'm not sure that the Shadow Justice Secretary mentioned the victims once in his contribution this afternoon.
Jim Allister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think we all know that it is the notoriety of the Kebatu case which has brought the Justice Secretary to the House today. But we also know that in the year 24-25 there were 262 such wrongful releases. How many independent investigations were held into any of those? With what result? And how do we get to the point where on average we have 5 wrongful releases per week? Shouldn't action have been taken long ago?
Well, I agree with him that action should have been taken long ago when this story began under the last government. That action is beginning now.
Lewis Cocking.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The fundamental responsibility of any government is to keep its citizens safe. But from the mistaken release of a dangerous foreign sex offender to scrapping future prison sentences for over half of offenders, which side is Labour on? The side of hard-working, law-abiding British public, or the criminals that target and exploit them?
Secretary of State.
I've got to say to the honourable gentleman that I think his constituents will be pleased that we are increasing the number of prison places after the horrific legacy from the last government, that we're reversing some of the cuts that we saw under the last government, that we've got a sentencing bill passing through this Parliament, and that we will be coming forward with a courts bill, all to deal with the chaos that we inherited in our justice system. And I've got to tell him, it's really rich when we're talking to a party that cut 20,000 police officers in our country.
Mark Pritchard.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I just say to the Justice Secretary, it is wearing a bit thin referring to the last government's record. This government has been in power for over 12 months, so it just isn't going to wash with the British public. Can I also say to the Justice Secretary, I think he does his calm better than he does his livid. He mentioned to my honourable friend, the member from North Dorset, I think he paraphrased his own statement, but his statement clearly says that he did chair, exact words, over the weekend I chaired not 1 but 3 operational meetings with the police. And members across this House, on all sides of the House, will know we can attend strategy meetings, but we never interfere with operational matters. So I think the House and members of the public, and indeed police officers around this country, deserve more clarity on that. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may, it says in the statement, page 2, members will also be aware that there are national security considerations with a case like this. What are those national security considerations? It's a bit confusing. First time I've heard this is an open court criminal conviction. So what are the national security implications? And finally, just so he knows I haven't gone too tough on him today, can I commend his decision to appoint Dame Lynn Owens a first-class public servant?
Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman. We're actually friends, despite the nature of his questioning. I think it is important that the police were able to give me an operational update, and I thank them for the work that they did across the Metropolitan Essex and the British Transport Police, and I'm sure that his constituents value that. And look, I'm sorry that he doesn't want me to mention the record of the last government, but I've got a feeling that as he sat there on the benches when they were in government, he was hugely disappointed with their record on crime and their record on the justice system.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the House will be aware, I was once a Epping Forest District Councillor and an Essex County Councillor, so I know both Epping and Chelmsford. It's fair to say that, given the high-profile nature of this particular case, public confidence is at an all-time low. Did the Justice Secretary consider his position? And if not, why not?
I really think that's a ridiculous question. He knows the answer. The answer is no. What I considered carefully was what my predecessors were up to in the last government, to allow this spike, to do nothing about it. And when I looked at the cases, particularly the case involving someone who was let out and went on to commit a sexual assault, I wondered why there were no independent investigations set up under the last government.
Paul Carler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Justice Secretary admits, there's a staffing crisis in our prisons which his government inherited from the brass-necked Tories. Over one-third of prison officers now have less than 2 years' experience. With too many officers leaving the profession and too few joining, is it any wonder mistakes like this happen increasingly frequently? But whilst the Ministry of Justice has sought to address the prison officer shortfall by recruiting overseas, as we've heard, the Home Office is undermining those actions by raising the payment threshold for the skilled worker visa. So, can I ask the Justice Secretary simply, yes or no, is the Justice Secretary asking the Home Office to add prison officers to the skills shortage list?
Secretary of State.
Well, as I've said, it's right and proper that the Home Office has a thorough regime for skilled workers, and I would support them in that endeavour. It's also important that we have the bank of prison officers that we need, and it's my job to ensure that we have that, whether they are able to come from abroad or whether, of course, as the vast majority of them do, come from our own country.
Luke Evans.
Almost a dozen pages in the statement, almost an hour taking questions, and I haven't heard one word. Sorry. And that's really important, actually, particularly for the father and the 14-year-old victim. Now, the Justice Secretary said a number of times he's personally reached out and thanked the police. Has he personally reached out to the victims? Has he tried to speak to them? Has he tried to say sorry?
Well, of course I'm sorry. Sorry that any victim of crime had the anxious weekend that they had. And it was important for me to ensure that police liaison were in touch with them, and I'm grateful to Essex Police to do that, and important to me that Lynn Owens is able to speak to them so that their concerns are reflected in her full and final report.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. How many of those released in error under this Labour government are still at large?
Secretary of State.
As she would expect, there are a number of people released under different regimes. Some of them will be released at home and will be leaving hopefully productive lives. Others will be back in prison. Some are recalled under licence. All of this will be examined by the independent full investigation.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The fact of the matter is that some 262 prisoners were freed in error in the year to March, almost an epidemic, compared to 115, 128% increase, according to data from the Ministry of Justice own department. I have absolute respect for the Honourable Deputy, and he knows that. But does the Minister accept that this is absolutely shameful, exemplifies the changes that are needed within our justice system to restore justice, and remind people that the penalty of crime is to lose their way of life and their rights, and not simply a holding cell where they tap their fingers, waiting while serving a fraction of their sentence, and hoping that they are one of the growing number to simply be sent home without being rehabilitated, which should rather be detained within the system. Thank you.
Yes, I'd want to associate myself with all the remarks made by the honourable gentleman. He's completely right. It's totally unacceptable. People who commit crimes deserve to be punished. I think the public wants them also to be rehabilitated. It's got to be punishment that works, to released in an appropriate fashion, but to be released into the community or sent back to their country in the appropriate way. And we've got to ensure that the system gets that right every single time.
And that concludes the statement. Point of order, Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, on Saturday, the member for Runcorn and Helsby said, "It drives me mad when I see adverts full of black people, full of Asian people." The member also said, "It doesn't reflect our society." Madam Deputy Speaker, as the MP for Brent East, one of the most diverse constituencies in the UK, you can be black and brown and be British, so I'm completely offended by that comment. It is a racist comment, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can you imagine the constituents of that MP going to see her knowing that she's a racist? Madam Deputy Speaker, these comments appear to be in breach of MP's Code of Conduct, in particular, the 7 Principles of Public Life.
Order. Can the Honourable Lady please reflect on her language and withdraw the remark about another Honourable Member in this place?
Madam Deputy Speaker, that comment is absolutely a racist comment. And if we cannot call that comment out in this House, that is in breach of the Nolan Principles for MPs. And I want to know, Madam Deputy Speaker, if you can help me in ensuring that...
Order. For clarity's sake, it's the calling of a member of this House a racist.
Madam Deputy Speaker, to say that, let me just quote again what the member for Runcorn and Helsby said. "It drives me mad when I see adverts full of black people and full of Asian people. It doesn't reflect society." Madam Deputy Speaker, that is a racist comment. And it is against the Nolan Principles. And how can we ensure that members of Parliament abide by the Nolan Principles?
It's not the comment that the Honourable Member is referring to. It's the fact that that she called the member a racist that is the issue. If you can please reflect on your remarks of calling a member of this House a racist and stick to the comments being a racist. It may be that she considers that that is dancing on the pin of her head, but it's important that we all act with respect and set an example to the country.
Given me déjà vu, I appreciate that in this House that we are not supposed to be disrespectful and call members of Parliament, MPs, what they actually are. Ultimately, the comment is a racist comment. It's quite strange that I'm unable to call out the member for being a racist, having made a racist comment.
Order. Please, it's time and time again. Can you please consider withdrawing the comment about a member of this House being a racist?
I don't want to be thrown out of Parliament again. So I will withdraw the fact that I am referring to the Member of Parliament as a racist because of her racist comments.
Has she informed the member for Runcorn and Helsby that she intended to refer to her in the chamber?
I have.
The Chair is not responsible for comments made by individual members outside this place. If the honourable member considers there has been a breach of the Code of Conduct, the proper procedure is to complain to the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. Point of order, Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have a point of order on the same person but a different point. I rise in a point of order to raise a matter of both parliamentary courtesy and political accountability. I have been informed that the member for Runcorn and Helsby last week held a political meeting in my Liverpool Riverside constituency with any prior notification to me. I have informed the member that I would be raising this as a point of order. And while there is no formal rule preventing members from visiting other constituencies, it is a fundamental convention of this House that MPs respect the local representation of their colleagues and notify them before seeking to engage with their constituents. They know they're not welcome coming into my constituency stirring hate and division. To ignore this convention of the House is discourteous. To do so in a city like mine with a very long and proud history of diversity is politically provocative. I call on the House to recognise that such actions undermine the norms of mutual respect between members and disregard the rights of constituents to be represented by their elected MP. The people of Liverpool Riverside do not welcome this opportunistic political activity. Does the Deputy Speaker agree with me that this matter requires urgent attention, and can the Deputy Leader of the House reaffirmed their principle that parliamentary conventions and respect for local representation must be upheld by all members?
I thank the honourable member for her point of order and for confirming that she has notified the member for Runcorn and Helsby in advance. Mr Speaker has always been clear that members intended to visit another colleague's constituency, except for purely private purposes, must inform colleagues in advance. Point of order, Simon Hoare.
The Honourable Lady for Brent East is absolutely right to draw the House's attention to the Nolan principles of public life, and they fall within the auspices of my Select Committee to keep a weather eye on, and of course it's an important anniversary of the Nolan principles this year. Given the fact that it is an important anniversary, and given the fact that the government has pulled together a whole variety of propriety and ethics under one body, might it now not be appropriate for the authorities of this place to reissue to all members what those principles are, that they are as enduring and relevant today as they were when Lord Nolan first penned them, and if we all abided by them fully all of the time, political and public life may be a little better.
I thank the honourable member for his point of order. It's a very interesting idea. They are set out in the Code of Conduct, but I'll make sure that Mr Speaker is aware of his comments. I have to notify the House, in accordance with the Royal Assent Act 1967, that the King has signified his royal assent to the following acts. Bus Services Act 2025, deprivation of citizenship orders, effect during appeal Act 2025, Renters' Rights Act 2025, Absent Voting, Elections in Scotland and Wales Act 2025, General Cemetery Act 2025. We now move on to the business of the day. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Victims and Courts Bill as amended in the Public Bill Committee to be considered.
Now, we will begin with Government New Clause 13, with which it will be convenient to consider the other selected new clauses and amendments as listed on the selection paper. I call the Minister to move Government New Clause 13. Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is truly an honour to open this debate and to bring the Victims and Courts Bill before the House. This bill is about people. Victims who have suffered unimaginable trauma, their families, and ensuring that they receive justice. It is about restoring faith in our justice system that can often feel cold and confusing. And this delivers on this government's driving mission for safer streets, making sure victims are supported, that offenders are held to account, and that justice is delivered swiftly and fairly. The deep-rooted issues in our criminal justice system need no repeating here. The House knows that this is a system that requires large-scale reform after years of neglect. There is a long road ahead, but this bill takes an important step forward. At its core are victims' experiences. This government is bringing forward real, tangible measures to ensure that victims' voices are heard, that their needs are recognised, and that their rights are respected. This will strengthen our courts, improving efficiency and fairness across the system. Madam Deputy Speaker, these are much-needed changes, and I am deeply grateful to honourable and right honourable members on all sides of this House for their time, their insight in considering them, and indeed to all of the organisations, advocates and survivors who have shared their experiences and helped us shape this legislation. I am sure the House will therefore join me in paying tribute to the families of Jan Mustafa, Olivia Pratt-Cobell, Zara Alina and Sabina Nessa. And I would like to welcome to this place Aisha Hussein, Cheryl Corbell and Antonia Elverson. They are in the public gallery today. I would also like to thank Jabina Islam, Farah Naz, the Justice for Victims group, which includes Susan and Jeremy Everard, Glenn and Becky Eunice, Katie Brett, Paula Hudgell, Aisha Hussein, the Bethan family, all for their courage and strength in campaigning amongst immense grief for their loved ones. 3 government amendments at report stage have further strengthened this bill, delivering clearer, stronger protection for victims, and I will turn to these briefly now, and again thank you all to everyone who has worked so constructively with me and officials in the Ministry of Justice to discuss the issues and concerns. New Clause 14 and Amendments 12 to 21 restrict the exercise of parental responsibility for perpetrators of rape where their crime has resulted in the birth of a child. This amendment will of course protect children, but it will also help shield the victim from their perpetrator interfering in their lives. Because those who commit this horrific crime should clearly never be able to use parental rights to control or torment their victim. I would like to take a moment to pay tribute to a woman I am proud to call my colleague and even prouder to call my friend. Many in this House will already have deep admiration for the member for Bolsover. And I want to place on record that this change is hers. It is for her, her children, and those just like them up and down the country that she has dedicated her life to fighting tirelessly for. Yeah.
I thank the Minister for giving way. I want to add my personal admiration to the member for Bolsover, who has been a fantastic champion for this particular new clause. Her predecessor in this House was called the Beast of Bolsover. I think she's the Brave of Bolsover, because every time she speaks in this House, she's incredibly brave, and I want to pay tribute to her.
Here, I echo those sentiments entirely. It has genuinely been my privilege to hear her story and to work with her to ensure that this measure works to stop rapists taking an active role in a child's life when that child was conceived as a result of rape. I cannot imagine the enormous complexity that mothers such as her face in this situation, and I am in awe of her bravery and that of so many others. This measure will ensure that rapists cannot take active steps in a child's life where that child has been conceived as a result of the crime that they have been convicted for. And in order to protect as many children as possible, our measure features a 2-track process. Where the Crown Court is satisfied that the child was conceived of rape, it must make a prohibited steps order restricting the offender's parental responsibility unless it is not in the interests of justice to do so. We recognise that rape can occur within an abusive relationship, and this may make it difficult to prove at a criminal trial that it actually led to the child's conception. Where this is the case, but the court considers the rape may have led to the conception of the child, it will refer the matter to the family court via the local authority. This 2-track process sends a clear message that we will protect all children born of rape, no matter the circumstances. The government recognises the clear risk that serious child sex offenders pose to their children, and that is why we have brought forward Amendment 10, which will expand Clause 3 of the bill. It means that when someone is sentenced to 4 or more years for serious child sexual abuse against any child, the courts will automatically restrict their parental responsibility. The process will remain the same. At the point an offender is sentenced, the Crown Court will be required to make a prohibited steps order restricting the offender's exercise of parental responsibility for all the children for whom they hold. For an offender to be in scope of this measure, they will have to have demonstrated that they are unable to protect children and consider their welfare. That is why our measure includes all serious child sexual abuse offences against all child. And unlike the previous government's plans in the Criminal Justice Bill, this is not just limited to the offence of child rape. What is more, unlike the previous government, this government will actually deliver it. We are taking this important step today to protect even more children by preventing these individuals from taking active steps in their children's lives. We have recognised the strength of feeling on this issue, and I am grateful to my friends, the members, especially, as already mentioned, my honourable friend, the members for Bolsover, but also to my honourable friend, the member for Lowestoft, the member for Dwyfor Meirionydd, and Baroness Harman in the other place. They have been unwavering in their advocacy for the protection of children. Safeguarding children is of the utmost importance to this government, and this amendment ensures that we are doing just that.
I will happily give way to my honourable friend. She just mentioned some pioneering women in this place who've campaigned on this very issue for a number of years. But today's amendment stands on the shoulders of the brave victims and survivors who've spoken out over so long as well. This corrects a historic injustice whereby convicted sex offenders and paedophiles children are protected from them, but before now, their own children are not. And this government is now taking steps to make sure children who are, through no fault of their own, and their parents are protected from these vile sex offenders.
My right honourable friend is right. This bill is a testament to the victims and survivors, those brave victims and survivors who have spoken out about this injustice, and it is this government that is correcting that. My right honourable friend also talks about standing on the shoulders of brave, brilliant women in this place who have come before us and are still here. And it is quite apt now that I would also like to pay tribute to her, because new clause 13 concerning the misuse of non-disclosure agreements known as NDAs is a testament to her brilliant campaigning on this work. The government is very clear that NDAs must not be used to silence victims or witnesses of crime. Victims must be free to tell their truth, to seek help and to warn others. New clause 13 will void NDAs to the extent that they seek to prevent a victim or a direct witness from speaking about criminal conduct to anyone and for any purpose. It will also protect disclosures about how the other party responded to the conduct or allegation, so that victims are not prevented from sharing that full context of their experience. This measure builds on the Employment Rights Bill, which addresses the use of NDAs in cases of workplace harassment and discrimination. The measure will bind the Crown, but it will not apply to a very narrow cohort of specified agreements for national security reasons. It includes regulation-making powers to define accepted NDAs, where both parties genuinely wish to retain confidentiality and to ensure that certain disclosures will always be permitted. Once commenced, this measure will replace Section 17 of the Victims and Prisoners Act 2024, which allows limited disclosures to certain bodies. Together with the Employment Rights Bill, we are taking the necessary steps to ensure that NDAs cannot be misused to silence victims or obstruct justice. I'd now, Madam Deputy Speaker, like to briefly address a number of other concerns that have been raised and tabled as amendments. I will not preempt what will be said today in the debate, and I will give honourable and right honourable members the time to make their cases. However, I again thank those on all sides of the House for engaging with me and setting out their concerns. Turning to the amendment tabled by my honourable friend for Bristol East, which seeks to place a statutory duty on the Crown Court and HMCTS to determine whether an offender has parental responsibility for a child following sentencing. The amendment is very well intentioned, but it does risk creating practical difficulties. Determining whether a person holds parental responsibility, has dependent children or children living in their household may require interpretation of family court orders, birth records or informal caregiving arrangements. These are matters for the family court. Imposing such a duty on the Crown Court risks delaying sentencing. This government made a manifesto commitment to identify and provide support for children affected by parental imprisonment, and the Ministry of Justice and Department for Education are committed to working together to determine the best way forward to do this and deliver on that commitment, to make sure that every child gets the support that they need. The Right Honourable Member for Newark and the Honourable Member for Chichester have tabled amendments to remove the 4-year custodial threshold that applies to Clause 3 and to expand the number of cases where Clause 3 will apply. I want to be clear. This measure is not simply about when parental responsibility should be restricted. It is about when that restriction should happen automatically. We need to be mindful that this is a very novel measure. Removing the threshold would add a very large number of cases to what is an untested approach. More cases will also mean more applications to the family court, and it is important that we do not overwhelm the court and create delays which will put the vulnerable children already in the system at further risk. We want to be sure that there are no adverse consequences for those children and their families already in the family court, and that is why we have struck to keep this measure narrow, so we can understand exactly how it is working in practice and what those impacts are. As I said at second reading and through the passage of this bill committee, this is just the beginning. As part of implementing these measures, we will seek to understand how they operate in practice and ensure that there are clear routes through the family court for the parental responsibility of any perpetrator who does not fall into this measure to be restricted. The Right Honourable Member for Newark has also tabled amendments on the unduly lenient sentencing scheme. Parliament intended the ULS scheme to be an exceptional power, and I recognise the importance of finality in sentencing to avoid ongoing uncertainty for victims, those convicted, and society more broadly about the sentence to be served. However, I do recognise the exceptionally difficult circumstances for victims and their families in making a referral to the Attorney-General within the 28-day limit. The Law Commission is carrying out a review of criminal appeals and held a public consultation which sought views from a range of different individuals and reforms to the ULS scheme. It did include extending the time limit and offences in scope. The Government will, of course, carefully consider the review's final recommendations. However, today I want to assure members from across the House that I have heard the strength of feeling on the unduly lenient sentencing scheme. The amendments have been tabled on this matter raise very important issues, and I will be continuing to look at this carefully as it progresses to the other place. On that, I make a commitment. The Honourable Member for Newark has also tabled an amendment on victim personal statements, a topic on which I must also pay tribute to my honourable friend, the Member for the Forest of Dean, for his dedicated campaigning on. Victim personal statements can be an incredibly powerful way for victims and their families to tell the court how the crime has impacted them, and for the court to directly hear evidence about the harm caused when considering its sentencing of the offender. This is the victim's voice in the courtroom. It is important to understand that these statements are evidence submitted to the court to assist the court in determining sentences. As evidence, they are subject to strict rules which the court applies to ensure that the criminal justice process works fairly and effectively, and that is why the content is limited to explaining the impact of this crime. However, I will happily give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. It takes me back to a family and the father of young Violet Grace, who was killed in 2017, 4 years old, 80 miles an hour in a 30-mile zone, and the people involved went missing. And during the court case some years later, during the reading, they wanted to read out the victim's statement fully in the court, and the defendant's barrister objected, and the judge accepted that objection. The barrister gave the parents, the CPS barrister gave the parents a copy of the victim's statement, highlighted with what they could not say. They went out of the courtroom to alter their statement. This was a young couple with a younger child. It was horrendous what happened to Victor Violet, and her mother-in-law. Life impact on her life was just horrendous. They went into that court and they felt like the criminal. They felt like they were like the defendants. They felt that they were doing wrong, and they then were asking, what can we say, what can we not say? The father has texted me this morning and he said, thank you, Mary. after all these years, I can see some light in the future. We don't want other people to suffer this. And I do hope that this goes through and that we can get something. This family, they've now got another little girl. But I just want to thank this government for getting round to it, because this bill has been going through and that's been going through, and it's just so terribly traumatic. The whole town feel it for these parents. But thank you so much for Violet Grace's parents.
Can I thank my honourable friend for raising the case of Violet Grace? She has been a tireless campaigner and supporter of the family for many years. I have had the privilege of meeting the Eunice family several times and hearing directly how their experience of their victim impact statement and the limitations placed on them as to what they could say in court has affected them and essentially silenced them and meant that their pain was not heard by the perpetrator. I am committed to working with them and the other Families for Justice campaign. The honourable member opposite, we've had extensive conversations on this, and any honourable member in this House on looking for a way forward as to how we ensure that the victim's voice is best represented in sentencing. We do not need legislation for this, Madam Deputy Speaker. In fact, legislation could potentially make this worse in terms of re-traumatising victims by making them say two separate statements, limiting in statute even further the parameters of what can be said. I do not want to limit or silence any victims. I want to work with them to ensure that there is universality, there is support for them when completing their victim impact statements, and that the guidance is there so that anyone knows exactly what can be said in that impact statement. It is vitally important that we give victims a voice, and I am determined to achieve that. I know that my honourable friend, the member for Lowestoft, will speak to her amendment to place a duty on certain authorities to commission specific support services for victims and caregivers of victims of abuse and exploitation. Again, this is well-intentioned, but we do not agree that it is helpful to place a statutory obligation on certain authorities to commission certain support services. The MOJ already provides grant funding to police and crime commissioners that is used to commission support services for victims of abuse and exploitation, which includes ring-fenced funding for sexual violence and domestic abuse services. It is for the PCCs to determine what best support is there for their local area. However, I again remain committed to working with her and others to ensure that victims get the best support that they need. My honourable friend, the member for Rotherham, has tabled an amendment which seeks to reform the Criminal Injuries Compensation Scheme in relation to compensating victims of child sexual abuse. This government is, of course, absolutely committed to supporting victims. However, we believe that reforming the scheme in one way that only benefits victims of child sexual abuse or any other single crime type would undermine its principle of universality. My honourable friend, the member for Rotherham, and I, as well as my honourable friends, the member for Warrington North and the member for Birmingham Northfield, and all of those who attended the Westminster Hall debate we had earlier this year, will know the strength of feeling towards the Criminal Injuries Compensation Scheme. It is not working. It needs reform, and I am committed to working with them and others and victims and survivors to not make this piecemeal and to look at how we can make it the most effective and sustainable scheme to provide compensation to victims. The honourable member for Maidenhead will no doubt speak to his amendment on support for families bereaved by homicide abroad. Bereaved families will, in many instances, need support tailored to their case. We have heard that these families need to be clearer about what that offer from UK agencies are and what the Homicide Service even is and how to access it. That is why we are working with departments across government, agencies and the Victims Commissioner to produce a clear, accessible guide to support families bereaved by homicide abroad. I am very grateful to the charity Murdered Abroad for working alongside us to make sure that that guidance delivers on its aims and we help those families who are stuck in limbo. I will come to a close by emphasising again the importance of this bill. It is a foundation for a better justice system, one that provides even greater protection for victims and delivers swifter, more efficient justice. It will not solve every issue we face overnight, but it is a strong, determined step forward, a signal that this government stands shoulder to shoulder with victims. And again, I want to sincerely thank members on all sides of this House for their engagement with this bill. We work together in this place, and this place is at its best when we do come together for the sake of victims and survivors. And I look forward to hearing this debate and responding to all of the views, and I'm looking forward to a really healthy debate. For now, I commend the government amendments and new clauses to this House.
New clause NC 13, victims' rights to make disclosures relating to criminal conduct.
The question is that Government New Clause 13 be read a second time. I call Liberal Democrat spokesperson Jess Brown-Fuller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The cornerstone of our justice system should always be the support and protection of victims and survivors, ensuring that those that have suffered at the hands of others can go on to live a life without fear and not defined by the actions of those who harmed them. And this is achieved by putting victims and survivors' needs at the heart of the justice process, ensuring that justice is served and seen to be served swiftly through properly funded support, and both protection and rehabilitation must be robust and effective. All of this has underpinned many of the issues that victims and survivors currently face that fill our local surgery appointments and our inboxes, often with harrowing accounts of a system failure that continues to compound their trauma. And we recognise that this Labour government is having to untangle this mess. The court backlogs, which delay justice, prison overcrowding, releasing criminals onto the streets without warning, and the hollowing out of support services that victims rely on. So we in the Liberal Democrats therefore welcome the intention and many of the measures in this bill aimed at ensuring that victims are listened to and that their experience in the system improves. In particular, we welcome the bill's measures compelling offenders to attend their sentencing hearings. This is, for many victims seeing justice done, an important aspect of the process, a moment of closure, or for some, the beginning of their recovery, something that more often than not they've waited far too long to actually see. Ensuring that offenders are seen to face the consequences of their actions is vital for a lot of victims' journeys. We also welcome the provisions to restrict parental responsibility in instances of rape or sexual assault against a child, both in the bill and in the government's amendments, including when a child is conceived after a rape and when an offender has parental responsibility for any child. And I give credit to the Honourable Member for Bolsover for being a tireless advocate for this, and also for being so brave in sharing her personal story. And this was something that my honourable friends for North East Hampshire and South Devon also called for at the Bill Committee stage, and it's been a long-standing campaign for families and victims across the country, and it's very reassuring that the Justice Secretary and the Victims Minister have heard their calls, picked this up and made it an important part of the bill. We're also really pleased to hear about the Victims Helpline, which could provide valuable support for so many, although we do remain concerned about the sufficiency of the resources behind this to make the service genuinely effective, and I'd appreciate further clarity from the Minister on the resources that are being made available for this helpline. Likewise, the extension of the powers of the Victims Commissioner is also a constructive move. Empowering them to work on behalf of victims when a case is in the public interest is important for improving the experience of victims and witnesses, and most importantly, learning lessons for the future, which successive governments have not been very good at doing. We also do believe there are gaps in the provisions of this bill that could be improved upon, and these have formed the basis for our amendments. But I'm pleased to hear the Minister say that this is not the end of the journey. And this is us laying out where we'd like to see this go. So to that end, New Clause 7 seeks to extend the Victim Contact Scheme, repairing some of the gaps in provision, ensuring that victims have information about offenders, how they can apply for licence conditions, provide statements to parole hearings and appeal decisions is vital for many victims' journeys after a crime and for their feeling of safety. We therefore believe that the scheme should be extended to victims of offenders serving less than 12 months for violent or sexual offences, to victims in cases involving coercive or controlling behaviour, stalking or harassment, and to bereaved families in manslaughter or death by dangerous driving cases. New Clause 8 would ensure that victims of criminal offences are entitled to free court transcripts, something that should be universal to ensure transparency and an accessible method of processing a court case for all those involved in a criminal justice system, when so much that happens in a court trial feels like a foreign language to so many accessing it, being able to process it afterwards. I know that my honourable friend for Richmond Park has done exemplary work on this topic, and that the issue has support across the House, notably in a Conservative amendment, despite their decision to ignore it during the decade they were in charge of the Ministry of Justice. The rollout of free court transcripts for victims of rape is a welcome step, but should not be the end of our ambition. to ensure that all victims can have this important document following a trial. New Clause 21 requires the Secretary of State for Justice to make a statement to the House within 2 weeks of the publication of any review, report or inquiry into the experiences of victims, including those produced by the Victims Commissioner. When things do go wrong in serious national cases where hundreds, perhaps thousands, have been let down by the justice system, it is vital that the country sees acknowledgement, apology and action from the relevant authorities, including the government. And this new clause would give honourable members across the country the opportunity to scrutinise the government's response in all instances. New Clause 19 specifically mandates local authorities to prepare strategies for victim support to ensure there are no postcode lotteries of support services relating to domestic abuse, sexual offences and child exploitation. And New Clause 20 requires relevant authorities to prepare an annual report on the availability and adequacy of support services for carers of victims of domestic abuse and sexual assault. These services are essential for victims finding pathways to moving on from those horrific crimes.
Would the Honourable Member give way?
Happily give way.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. This bill's support of domestic abuse survivors is very welcome, but it is only half the story. In Horsham, one of my constituents arrived at court to see her abuser stand trial, only to be told at the courthouse door that the case was pulled due to a lack of capacity. That trial was delayed for 2 years, by which time her abuser breached 2 restraining orders. So would the Honourable Member agree that unless we see concrete measures to improve capacity above and beyond the recent increase in sitting days, then this bill cannot fulfil its promise to the public?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention and also for highlighting the impact that court delays have on victims. And I think it's an opinion shared across the House that it's totally unacceptable when a victim arrives to have their day in court and then gets sent away. And I know that the government, the reason we have a lot of legislation coming through at the moment is because they are trying to address this from multiple different angles. And I hope to see ambition in the area. I would also like to just briefly highlight the work of my honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, and New Clause 12, which requires necessary updates to the Victims Code for relatives of victims of murder or manslaughter whose loved ones have been murdered abroad, who currently sit outside of the Victims Code. Although this affects around 80 families annually, the toll on falling outside of scope and receiving little to no support or not knowing where to go to get the support is unacceptable. As has been outlined, we in the Liberal Democrats are concerned about gaps in this bill and believe that more can be done to support victims and survivors, but we recognise the ambition that is behind it, and we urge the government to take on board our amendments to better protect victims and survivors. Thank you.
I call Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the interests of time, I will focus only on New Clause 2, which is in my name, though I am also supporting the backbench New Clauses 1, 10 and 11, and I very much welcome, of course, the Government's New Clause 14. And I do want to thank the Right Honourable Member for Billericay, who originally tabled this amendment. His subsequent elevation to the Shadow Cabinet means that he's had to withdraw his name. On the 21st of May 2024, I introduced the Children Parental Imprisonment Bill, with immaculate timing, as it turned out, as the general election was called the next day.